Burr is not here at this time. Senator Braun will be taking his place. Welcome to our committee this morning. We will each have an opening statement, and then we will introduce the witnesses. After the witnesses give their testimony, senators will each have 5 minutes for a round of questions. And while we were unable, again, to have this hearing fully open to the public or media for in-person attendance, live video, as always, is available on our committee website at help.senate.gov. If anyone is in need of accommodations, including closed captioning, please reach out to the committee or the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services. Today's hearing is long overdue. We have been through 4 years of attacks on workers' rights from the previous administration. It has now been 12 years since the minimum wage was raised, and it has been over 70 years since the National Labor Relations Act, the cornerstone of our nation's labor laws, was significantly updated. 70 years ago, there was no internet. Approximately 1/3 of women participated in the labor force. Racial segregation was allowed under the law, and the average retirement age and the average life expectancy were both around 68 years. While our ways of working and our workforce may have changed, the need for workers to be able to join together and have a voice in their wages and working conditions without fear remains as important as ever. Our labor laws are overdue for an update, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only made this need more clear and more urgent. This crisis has changed a lot over the last year and a half, but it has also shown us how much it needs to be changed. This past year, we witnessed the most unequal economic crisis in modern history unfold as women, workers of color, workers with disabilities, and workers with low incomes disproportionately lost jobs, wages, and more. We witnessed how important it is workers have paid family, sick, and medical leave, a livable wage, and quality affordable child care and health coverage. We witnessed growing inequality as millions of people lost jobs last year, and while the top 1% gained about $10 trillion in wealth. And increasing wealth inequality wasn't a pandemic-only phenomenon. It has been happening for decades. And all of this gave us an important reminder of the difference unions and the right to organize and collectively bargain make in countering this kind of extreme inequality. Here's what unions mean. Unions mean higher wages. In 2020, non-union workers were paid about 84 cents per dollar compared to union workers. Unions mean better benefits. For example, union workers are more likely to have paid sick days. And while only around 2/3 of non-union workers can get a retirement plan, health care plan, and prescription drug coverage through their employer, over 9 in 10 union workers had these benefits. And union workers were almost twice as likely to have the option of an employer-sponsored dental plan. Unions also mean safer workplaces. Unions work hard to educate members about their rights to a safe workplace. And as a result, unionized workplaces are much more likely to be held accountable for health and safety violations. And perhaps one of the most important aspects of union representation is knowing you have other workers in your corner to help make sure you are treated with respect and dignity in the workplace. Knowing you've got backup to help make sure you will not only be paid fairly, but treated fairly. In short, unions mean workers who are the ones truly making our economy run, have better wages and benefits that help them support their families and live their lives. That's why I'm proud Washington State has the 5th highest rate of union membership in the nation. But unfortunately for workers across the country, barriers to workers seeking to form or join a union have been mounting in recent years. We've seen employers try and at times succeed at misclassifying workers to deny them their rights, preventing workers from organizing and collectively bargaining through complicated contracts and subcontracts, and undermining union elections in too many ways to count. Meanwhile, efforts at the National Labor Relations Board to educate workers about their rights and enforce worker protections have dwindled, particularly as Republicans have worked to skew the board against workers in recent years. I'm really hopeful that the new NLRB nominees that have come before our committee recently will help start to fix this, because the results of this campaign against workers' rights have been deeply damaging, especially in light of this pandemic. Right now, only 1 in 8 essential workers is represented under a collective bargaining agreement. And some of the highest risk industries during this pandemic, healthcare, food, agriculture, have the lowest unionization rates. Stronger organizing and collective bargaining rights could have helped change the trajectory of this pandemic and saved lives by making sure that workplace safety was a priority, more workers had paid sick days, and more workers had the wages and benefits that they needed to stay economically secure, like quality, affordable health care and a reliable retirement plan. In short, the pandemic made it clearer than ever we've got to make it easier for workers to exercise their right to collectively bargain, and for unions to fight for the people they represent. Doing so will help us build our economy back stronger in a way that works for families and communities, not just those at the top. And it will help us build back fairer, as data show union memberships reflects the racial, ethnic, gender, and age diversity of America's workforce. Almost half of workers represented by a union are women, and nearly 4 in 10 union members are workers of color. When it comes to addressing racial inequities, data show Black union workers earn, on average, 16% more than their non-unionized counterparts. When it comes to the gender pay gap, women who are not represented by a union are paid 78 cents on the dollar compared to men, but women who are represented by unions are paid 94 cents on the dollar. And when it comes to creating more inclusive workplaces for people with disabilities, union-covered workers in general are more likely than non-union employees to request accommodations, regardless of disability status. So as we work to rebuild our economy in the aftermath of this pandemic, our work has to include steps to finally update our labor laws in order to protect and empower workers. Because we know our economy is stronger when working families are stronger, and our working families are stronger when unions are stronger. That's why I introduced the PRO Act earlier this year, and I'm pushing it hard to get across the finish line. But we can't stop there. We need to raise the minimum wage, provide a comprehensive paid leave program, and more. It's also why I supported the unionization vote of Amazon workers in Alabama, and I support the continued fight for unionization of Amazon workers in Washington State and workers across our country. And it is why we are having this hearing today. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you all for being here, about how we finally bring the NLRA into the 21st century, and how we can ensure every worker is able to form or join a union so they can bargain for better wages and benefits and safer workplaces in which they are treated with respect. With that, I will turn it over to Senator Braun for his statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I was asked to fill in for Ranking Member Burr, it's an honor to do it. Anyone in the U.S. Senate, I think I'm most recently off the pavement of actually living through these issues we're going to talk about here today. I come from Main Street. I chose not to go to Wall Street, to move back to my hometown. My wife did the same thing and has had a small business in our downtown for 43 years this September. When I ask her what she pays in terms of wages to her own employees, and they're like family, they're been there for a long time, way above what the average wage rate would be across most states, even in a low cost of living state like Indiana. And my discussion is going to center around one premise. I had a company that had 15 employees for 17 years. I know every aspect about what it takes to be successful in an enterprise, and it starts with treating your employees like family. And if you're going to grow into an enterprise like what I just left 2.5 years ago, it's because you've done all those things, and if you do it right, you don't need a union. And I'm for unions because you need them in places where you're up against a monolith of big business. But the premise today is going to be that whatever we do for workers' rights, which I believe in 100%, to be able to have them organize and express those, don't kill the golden goose that's made jobs for union workers possible. It's a small business. Remember, every company in this country, from General Motors to Amazon started probably with an employee or two, and did it in a hard-scrabble way like I did for 17 years, where my paycheck was generally lower, way under what it would have been for running a business or an enterprise, simply because of the fact that you deal with the economics at hand. And when you think about what it takes to get an enterprise large enough to have a union there representing employees, it is a perilous pathway. Most don't make it. And you need to measure, if we want the PRO Act to be considered, is it going to take out what allows unions to form in the first place, or what allows a little business to become a big one? And my contention is, and from what I'm hearing across the country in terms of small businesses, they think that this puts them in peril. And if you don't have small businesses that are healthy, you're not going to have big businesses, and you're not going to have employment bases that are large enough to need unions in the first place. So I'm worried that this is a one-size-fits-all, like many things we do here in D.C., and that for the reasons I'm going to mention here now, it's going to be detrimental to small business. And small business, most of them don't get a return on investment. They live out of that business for their wage, for their livelihood. And anything we do here, if it puts that in peril, it's a misguided effort from the top down, and in my opinion, is not needed. Ms. Cerolio, who has an enterprise in California, a place that largely rolls like the federal government in thinking you can do things from the top down. It's why many businesses are leaving the state. It's why many of us who consider doing business there do it with a second thought. We got there 10 years ago in my little business that now has become a big business, and that where we pay the highest starting wage in my hometown, in the lowest unemployment county. You don't feel welcome in places like that that tell you how you need to operate your business, and many times do it in a way that is going to chase you away from the very thing you're wanting to promote. Said earlier, I support the freedom to unionize. I think there's a place for it. You got big business. I've been one of the most outspoken here as a senator. That's a different type of entity than a Main Street enterprise. You may need to use dynamics differently to deal with them. But I want to list a few of the things. We got 27 right-to-work states. And this pretty well says that it's going to get rid of that if it can. To me, you're getting rid of the choice of whether you want to join a union or not. Unions, which I think should have the freedom to organize, got to make their case, though. You're going to end up in a place like Illinois where there's not a right-to-work law. Think about this. Their union membership has only gone up 1% since we put in right-to-work laws across the country. Union membership in Indiana has gone up 24% in a right-to-work state. Violating the rights of workers across America to prop up an outdated system that benefits Washington elites is not the answer. A union power grab, I'm not going to say that. I think that's kind of a hot phrase. I try to avoid them here. But if we're trying to grow anything for the sake of growing it, and if there's not merits to the case, it's misguided. The PRO Act will force employers to provide unions with work shift information and employees' personal contact information during organizing elections. Independent contractors, such as gig workers, will be made employees under the PRO Act, limiting these workers' ability to pick jobs and schedules that work for them and their families. The PRO Act will put the burden of proof on employers to prove that they didn't interfere in a union election, rather than on the party claiming that they did. The PRO Act will change the very definition of an employer by codifying a 2015 standard expanding joint employer status. This means that many small businesses would be considered joint employers. Litigation against franchise businesses nearly doubled due to this in 2015, And that's another issue to contend with. Many of the reasons folks don't go into a place like California is because the trial lawyers, in many cases, run the administrative dynamic there, chasing businesses away, losing jobs. For all of these reasons and many more, it's no surprise that American organizations across the country are strongly opposed to the PRO Act. Right here, a folder of over 280 organizations that represent small business have written accordingly. I ask unanimous consent to submit the 8 letters here representing more than 280 groups opposing the PRO Act.
Without objection.
Though government was much of the problem for small businesses last year, I acknowledge that without what we did here through the PPP in the moment of crisis, there is a need for it. That doesn't mean you take what we did and you broaden in a way that has already made a small business one of the most difficult things to grow into a large one. And if the PRO Act does anything to make it harder to start and grow a small business, everything that you're trying to do through the PRO Act becomes immaterial, and it's actually working against what you're really concerned with.
Thank you. We will now introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness has decades of experience in labor law protecting workers' rights. Mark Pierce is a former board member and chairman of the National Labor Relations Board. He was first appointed to the NLRB by President Barack Obama in 2010, served 2 terms on the board, concluding in August 2018. He is now a visiting professor and the executive director of the Workers' Rights Institute at Georgetown University Law Center. Before that, he was a senior scholar and lecturer at Cornell University's School of Industrial Labor Relations. Mr. Pierce, thank you for joining us. Look forward to your testimony. Next, I will introduce Dr. Heidi Schierholz, an economist with deep understanding of how workers' rights strengthen our economy as a whole. Dr. Schierholz is the senior economist and director of policy at the Economic Policy Institute, a nonprofit think tank focused on the needs of workers. She served as chief economist for the Department of Labor under President Obama, where she helped develop and execute initiatives to boost workers' rights, wages, and benefits, protect workers' savings, and increase workplace safety. Dr. Schierholz, we're pleased to have you with us today and look forward to hearing from you shortly. Our next witness is someone who knows firsthand some of the barriers workers are up against when they fight to exercise their rights. Gracie Heldman joins us from Pandora, Ohio. She works for the Hearthside Food Solutions. It's an industrial bakery with over 1,000 employees, which provides goods for familiar names like Nabisco, General Mills, and Kellogg. Mrs. Heldman has worked at the bakery for over 33 years in the packing department, and she has spent 20 of those years so far fighting to form a union. Mrs. Heldman, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to hearing from you about your experience. And now I will turn it over to Senator Braun to introduce our final witness, Jody Cirolia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jody Cirolia is a principal in Ellis Hospitality, which is now the 3rd generation hotel company based in California. Their portfolio currently has 7 hotel properties throughout California, a definition of a small business that's made it to the next level. Company was built and named to honor New York City's Ellis Island, where her family members had entered during the early years to pursue the American dream. Ms. Cirolia has grown up in the hospitality industry and even lived in a hotel owned by her extended family until the age of 11. She started learning about hotel operations, everything from housekeeping to the front desk. She has served as an Asian American Hotel Owners Association ambassador to the South Pacific region since 2015 and has been part of a franchise organization there since 2017. Since 2009, she's been involved in the Choice Hotels Owners Council. She lives in Temecula, California, I'll say that's close enough, and attended San Francisco State University. True example, someone that moves to this country based upon immigrants and entrepreneurs, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on the PRO Act today.
Thank you. Mr. Olia, thank you for joining us today to share your experience. With that, we will hear our witness testimony. Mr. Pierce, we will begin with you.
Chair Murray, Senator Braun, and members of the committee, and my fellow panel of witnesses. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the right to organize on empowering U.S. workers in the 21st century. As the introduction indicates, I was a former chairman of the National Labor Relations Board, and I've had close to 23 years of service with that agency and more time practicing before that agency while in private practice. Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, in 1935, out of recognition for workers' rights, fundamental rights. Despite its flaws, the NLRA was the first law to provide these protections. Among its fundamental purpose was to encourage collective bargaining, protect workers' rights to organize, and provide workplace democracy, so as to preserve worker integrity and balance and the relationship between labor and management. In that respect, the NLRA has lost its way. Because of lack of reform and years of manipulative interpretation, the Act has increasingly become ineffective in the 21st century. Workers are being classified outside of the Act's protection. Concerted activity for mutual aid or protection is being restricted and reinterpreted. And through the reversal of decades of precedent, union access to employees and members has been all but extinguished. Policy oscillation at the NLRB has created a confusing atmosphere where workers and businesses remain uncertain about their rights and obligations. Rules relating to conduct of union elections are subject to radical change with the change of administrations. Meanwhile, even when a union succeeds in becoming a bargaining representative, employers' unfair labor practices that aim to undermine employees' chosen bargaining representative can have a corrosive effect that linger for years. Studies have shown that within 1 year after an election, less than 50% of newly organized units have obtained their first collective bargaining agreement. There are also procedural obstacles that are in the way of worker rights. Workers are expected to know their rights, yet employers cannot be mandated to post notices advising employees of these rights because this agency is a reactive, not a proactive agency. Workers file charges with the NLRB and often are left to wait for a significant period of time. By the time justice is reached or a board order is enforced, years have gone by. By then, workers have lost homes, lost the respect of their family, and most of all, they have lost faith in a system that was designed to help them. The Act's inadequate remedies for unlawful conduct not only fail to deter or fully remedy violations, but in fact incentivize unlawful practices. The National Labor Relations Act provides only limited remedies to violations. The NLRA limits remedies to a cease and desist order or a notice posting, and where somebody is terminated, they get back pay and reinstatement. Yet other worker protection agencies provide for compensation such as punitive damages and compensatory damages. Title VII provides that, and the FLRA provides that. Unfair labor practices against undocumented workers go unremedied entirely. The Supreme Court held that undocumented workers are employees within the scope of Section 2.3 of the Act. We can celebrate that, but they also, in Hoffman Plastics, state that undocumented workers can't receive the remedy. They can't get the back pay that they lost, and in fact, they will lose their position. They're not entitled to being reinstated. And in all likelihood, if they used the process of the act, they will get deported. I will wrap up by saying this, because of course I have plenty more to say. Workers continue to need the protection of the labor laws. The pandemic underscored that need. Workers' rights and protections are meaningless if the laws are not responsive to workers and business models of the 21st century. This statute had its 86th birthday on July 5th. Let's celebrate by blowing out the candles, cutting the cake, and retooling this needed, vital piece of legislation for modern times. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to testify before this committee today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Dr. Sherholtz.
Chair Murray, Senator Braun, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this urgent matter, and I'm really going to dig in on the economics of this. And I'll start by saying that the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement declined from 27% to 12.1% between 1979 and 2020. This decline was not because workers don't want to be in unions. In the 4 decades, from the late 1970s to the late 2010s, the share of non-union workers who said they would vote to unionize if they were given the opportunity rose from 1/3 to nearly 1/2. The fact that workers want to be in unions is no surprise. When workers are able to form a union and collectively bargain, their wages, benefits, and working conditions all get better. So on average, a worker covered by a union contract earns 10.2% more than a similar worker who's not in a union. Union workers are more likely to have employer-provided health insurance, employer-sponsored retirement plans, paid vacation and sick leave, more predictable schedules, and safer workplaces. Further, the right to a union is directly relevant to our urgent national conversation around racial equity. Black workers are more likely than white workers to be in unions, and black workers who are in unions get a bigger boost from being in the union than white workers do. Those two facts together mean that unions help narrow the black-white wage gap, and research shows that this phenomenon is not new. By 1950, black workers were more likely to be in unions and had a larger union premium than white workers, and this means that the net effect of the mid-20th century spread of unionization was that the institution of collective bargaining was one of the most important institutions in our country for advancing racial economic justice, and conversely, the decline of unionization has played a significant role in the expansion of the black-white wage gap over the last 4 decades. I also want to highlight the fact that non-union workers benefit from the presence of unions. When union density is high, unions essentially set standards that non-union workers must meet in order to attract and retain the workers that they need. So this combination of the direct effect of unions on union members and this spillover effect to non-union workers means that unions are crucial for decent wage growth for working people. Research shows that deunionization accounts for 1/3 of the growth in inequality between typical workers and workers at the high end of the wage distribution in recent decades. The pandemic also taught us crucial lessons about the importance of unions. While the number of workers represented by a union declined in 2020 as the economy shed millions of jobs, the unionization rate rose because union workers saw less job loss than non-union workers. And this was due in large part to the fact that unionized workers had a voice in how their employers navigated the pandemic. They used this voice for things like negotiating terms of furloughs or work-sharing arrangements to save jobs. The importance of unions has been especially clear for frontline workers during the crisis. Unionized workers who provide essential services were able to do things like secure enhanced safety measures, additional premium pay, paid sick time, but like non-essential workers, Most essential workers are not unionized, and during the pandemic, many non-unionized essential workers were forced to work without personal protective equipment or access to paid sick leave or premium pay. The decline of unionization in recent decades has not been, as some would like us to believe, the natural result of a modern economy. It has been the result of fierce corporate opposition that has suppressed workers' freedom to organize. Aggressive anti-union campaigns were once confined to the most anti-union employers, but now they are the norm. And as the National Labor Relations Act though the National Labor Relations Act makes it illegal for employers to intimidate, coerce, or fire workers in retaliation for organizing, the penalties are so weak that they don't provide an actual economic disincentive for illegal union busting. And as a result, it is rampant. Employers are charged with illegal conduct in over 40% of union elections. Despite these relentless attacks on unions and collective bargaining, an update to labor law to rebalance the system has not happened. The huge gap between the share of workers who want a union and the share of workers who are in a union makes it clear that our system of labor law is not working. Policy changes like the Protecting the Right to Organize Act are crucial for rebuilding an economy that guarantees all workers the right to come together and have a voice in their workplace. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Heldman. Can you turn on your mic?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My name is Gracie Hellman, and I live in Pandora, Ohio. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me here today to tell my story. This is a story about a company that has broken the law for 20 years to stop its workforce from joining a union. I am a longtime employee at Hearthside Solutions in Macomb, Ohio. The company has huge bakeries all across the country that make cookies, crackers, bars, and other baked goods for companies like Kellogg, Nabisco, and General Mills. There are over 1,000 of us in the Macomb plant that runs 24 hours, 7 days a week. I've been working at Hearthside for over 33 years, and I can tell you working in a huge industrial bakery is hard work. The hours are long, and the pain can be really bad, especially in your wrist, shoulders, back. The company does not take health and safety seriously, so it's not really surprising the Macomb Bakery has been cited by OSHA many times and is one of the worst offenders in Ohio. That was one of the main reasons so many of us haven't wanted to join the Bakers Union since the late 90s. We haven't been overworked, we've been injured on the job, disrespected by supervisors, and forced to work in bad conditions. We wanted a union to protect us while we were at work, to give us a say about the conditions we had to work under, and to help us get respect from our bosses. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of support for the union. Most of us were fed up with the way we were being treated. In 2002, over 65% of us signed BCTGM union cards so that we could have an election to vote on the union. That seems simple enough, but instead of having the election soon after we filed a petition, the company was able to stall and delay the election for over 2 months. This gave the company plenty of time to run an anti-union campaign and scare the workers, which is what they did. First off, the company hired union busters to walk the floor of the bakery, spied on us, held mandatory anti-union meetings. They told us the plant would close, that we would lose our wages and benefits, and that we would be forced to go on strike. If we didn't go to these meetings, we would be fired. Then the company actually fired 7 people that supported the union. They're really scared people. Many of these people, they wanted to join the union, had signed union cards, were too scared to support it. When we finally had the union election after the company's months of delays, many of these union supporters voted no, and we lost the election. They were scared and felt the law did not protect them. The law was just not on our side. If the PRO Act had been in place, we would have had the election earlier. The company would not have been able to hire union busters and lie about the union, and the company would have suffered major penalties for firing union supporters. we would have won the first election almost 20 years ago. After the election in 2002, the union filed charges with the NLRB. Seems to me this was an open and shut case, but the case took more than 8 years to be decided. The Federal Court of Appeals finally found the company guilty, but only brought back 2 of the workers. For firing workers, breaking federal labor law, and dragging the NLRB case through the courts for 8 years, the company only received a slap on the wrist, and we still didn't have the protection of a union. The Federal Court of Appeals did order a rerun election. Once again, the company stalled and delayed the day of the election. The company ran a very vicious campaign. Hispanic workers like me were targeted. Many were told they would be deported if they supported the union. We finally had a rerun election in 2010, but the company had scared the workers so bad they voted against the union. Again, the union filed charges against the company, but it didn't make any difference. This was a really tough time for many of us that had been supporting for so long the union. I had workers that I was close to that committed suicide. Many others got severely depressed. From a personal standpoint, things went from bad to worse. A couple of years ago, a co-worker found bed bugs in some of the cases. And of course, they blamed us workers for this. The supervisors made a whole line of women march into their first day room where we were told to strip so a nurse could examine us for bed bugs. If we refused, we would be punished, sent home without pay, and possibly fired. So we stayed in line and stripped so we could be searched. It was humiliating. The next day, rumors ran about women in their granny pants going around the plant. It could only have come from supervisors. This was such a degrading experience that I will never forget. Last year, we had our 3rd attempt in 20 years to join the union. We had more than 60% of 1,200 workers signed union cards. Just like the previous election, the company hired union busters, spent their 3 months trying to put fear into the workforce. This time, they really focused on my Hispanic workers again. Many were threatened with deportation if they supported the union and voted yes. Even at the height of the pandemic, the company forced us to attend mandatory meetings. They set up a big tent outside the plant to make it look like we would be safe. They squeezed more than 150 of us inside the tent, sitting us side by side, less than 2 feet apart. Even though people were scared, I really thought we had a shot to win this election. We got closer than ever before in this election, but it was not enough to overcome the company's vicious anti-union campaign. For over 20 years, we have fought to join the BCTGM. For over 20 years, I have seen the law look the other way. Nothing protected our rights to join a union. And the worst part of it all is the company knew that. They knew they could do whatever they wanted, and at worst, they would get a slap on the wrist. I am just one worker who wants to join a union, but there are millions out there in America. They would love to join a union so they can have dignity, justice, and respect, and not have their rights stolen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Heldman. Appreciate that. Ms. Rolia.
Good morning, Chair Murray, Senator Braun sitting in for Ranking Member Burr, and distinguished members of the committee. What an honor and privilege it is here to sit here with you, and I thank you in advance for your time and your ability to listen to my story today. My name is Jyoti Sarolia. I'm from Temecula, California, and I'm the principal at Ellis Hospitality that owns and operates 7 hotels. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear before this committee today. I'm honored to share my story of small business ownership and discuss the views of local business owners everywhere as it relates to empowering American workers. I'll focus my comments on protecting the Right to Organize Act, or PRO Act. This is an issue of great importance to the 730,000 franchise business owners like me who employ nearly 8 million workers in a range of industries, and I appear before you today on their behalf as well. With both respect and candor, let me say this. The PRO Act is the most anti-small business bill in the history of Congress. With the stroke of a pen upon enactment, the PRO Act's joint employer and independent contractor provisions alone would steal the American dream of business ownership from countless entrepreneurs. But indirectly, I'm also here to testify on behalf of all the bakers, physical therapists, realtors, freelancers, truck drivers, doctors, caterers, rideshare drivers, insurance agents, salespeople, commercial fishermen, stylists, and many more who contribute so much to the economy and whose livelihood the PRO Act could upend. And not because of unionization, but because the PRO Act could practically demote any of these professionals from entrepreneur to employee. They don't want that, and I don't want that. As a franchise business owner, I have worked so hard to provide for my employees. My passion is making a difference in our team members' lives and growing more team members in the future so they can become upwardly mobile so that someday they can own their own hotel or franchise business if they want. And because, with due respect to great businesses like Starbucks and Chipotle, no matter how hard an employee works, you can't own a Starbucks and you can't own a Chipotle. But in franchising, you can own your own business. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, what color is your skin, who you love, or where you came from. That's why it's a business strategy that every member of the Senate should support. But instead, the PRO Act seeks to steamroll businesses run by women entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs of color, and others that operate and grow using the franchise method. And instead, the PRO Act seeks through its joint employer and independent contractor provisions to transform franchise systems from a network of small businesses into one big business. Why would 47 senators seek to consolidate so much corporate power at the expense of small businesses and owners like me? Put simply, this legislation could end the franchise business model, the business format that has perhaps provided the most accessible path to business ownership for entrepreneurs of all backgrounds. Why should 47 senators seek to enhance organized labor's political power at the expense of women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color like me? From the franchising perspective, these issues are bigger than the PRO Act today. The more important issue is that the incredible value of franchising needs to be more fully appreciated. My testimony today includes details on forthcoming Oxford economics research that reveals 3 takeaways. First, franchises are locally owned and keep their resources in local community, unlike a business run by a faraway headquarters. Second, franchising offers a path to entrepreneurship to people of diverse backgrounds who would not otherwise own a business. Big corporations don't offer entrepreneurship. And last, franchise jobs are good jobs that offer comparable pay and benefits to other Main Street business jobs. Madam Chair, the pandemic has thrown a historic curveball at the hospitality industry. There was no playbook for how hoteliers or other franchise owners were supposed to navigate the world. But due to hard work, support from our franchise brands, and even some SBA assistance, we are still here today, serving our employees, customers, and communities. Small businesses are just starting to recover, and now we are facing the PRO Act. Women and immigrants and people of color have faced enough barriers to business ownership over the years, haven't they? The PRO Act raises these barriers for people like me again. If you want to help build wealth for communities of color, if you want to support women entrepreneurs, if you want to give immigrants a shot at the American dream, and if you want to support people like me, then let's table the PRO Act. And let's build better policies that will both promote workers' future and protect the local franchise business owners in your states. Thank you for the opportunity, and again, your time, and what an honor and privilege it is to share our story.
Thank you again to all of our witnesses this morning. We will now begin a round of 5-minute questions of our witnesses, and I ask our colleagues again to please keep track of your clock. Stay within those 5 minutes. Mr. Pierce, the National Labor Relations Act has not been significantly updated since 1947. This failure to update the law has led to significant problems for workers trying to exercise their rights. And Dr. Scherholz, you've led research into the impacts of union membership for workers and the impact of declining union membership on working families for our economy. So let me ask both of you, what would be the impact of updating labor laws to enable more workers to have a voice in their workplace? Mr. Pierce, I'll start with you.
Thank you for the question, Chair Murray. The National Labor Relations Act was created for the purpose of providing employees with the opportunity to have workplace democracy. Workplace democracy provides an opportunity for employees to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. A collective bargaining agreement is essentially private law of the plant, which is mutually negotiated and gives workers a voice. The impact of that would be to provide more protections to employees, more opportunities for employees to negotiate circumstances like the pandemic, to provide an ability for both the employer and the employees themselves to have equal voice at the table to overcome issues as they come up, whether they be catastrophic issues or economic issues and wages and hours and safety issues.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Scherholz.
So what we know is over the last 4 decades, inequality has risen dramatically. Wages have really stagnated for working people for most of that period, and a big chunk of those trends is due to declining unionization. So the PRO Act, which would boost unionization, make it so workers who want to join a union are able to do so, it would reduce inequality. It would put thousands of dollars per year in the pockets of working people. It would raise their benefits. It would improve their working conditions. It really would push us towards an economy that works for all, that doesn't just work for a thin slice of people on the winning end of rising inequality.
Thank you. Mrs. Heldman, thank you for your courage today in telling your story. No one should be denied the ability to join together with other workers in the workplace to advocate for improved wages or working conditions. Tell us what it would mean for you to have a greater say in your workplace.
Well, it would mean
Do you want to turn on your microphone there? Thank you.
Thank you. It would mean to have a say on safety and issues on the workplace, and the PRO Act would give you that right, because without the PRO Act you don't have that. You don't have them rights. With the PRO Act you would have your dignity, your justice, and respect, and you wouldn't be told by, when you're being stalled your rights and everything, you wouldn't be told by policemen when you want to report this injustice that you need a union, that the law can't protect you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Scherholz, you've dedicated your career to studying the economics of work, including union membership's effect on wages and job quality for workers of color and women. Why does union membership have such a positive impact on workers who make low wages, or workers of color or women and other groups that face barriers in the workplace?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can I'll talk first about the impact on women. We know that the unionization rate for men and women right now is about the same. Like, it's no longer the case that men disproportionately are in unions, and one of the reasons for that is that unions really do help women workers. They raise their wages, raise their benefits, improve their working conditions. We know one of the things that's still true in our society today is that women shoulder disproportionate responsibility for care work. One of the things unions do is make sure workers have greater paid sick leave, they're more likely to have vacation pay, holiday pay, more likely to have more input into their schedules, more advance notice of their schedules, and those are the kinds of things that make it possible for many women who have care responsibilities to work, or at least to work without enormous chaos added to their lives. And I'll stop there because I've taken a bunch of time, but the benefits of unionization to workers, to the lowest wage workers, are absolutely enormous.
Thank you very much. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think today the conversation gets framed very well by the testimony from Mrs. Heldman and Ms. Cerullo. As someone that has owned a business and treated my employees like family, that's a tragic story. That's the reason you need unions out there, but you can't necessarily generalize upon it. And I think anything that is done, you do not want to throw a wet blanket on the point I made earlier, that if you're making it more difficult for small businesses to become large, you're defeating the purpose of even what you're trying to attempt here in the PRO Act. I think we've got a second round of questions, and I'll have questions for the entire panel. I'm going to start with Ms. Cerullo. You're in California. I cited earlier that my own business got there 10 years ago, and that you're in the hotel business. What are you hearing from the abundance of other employers, especially in California, about something like this? I cited 280 organizations, out there thinking that this act is going to wreak havoc on the ability to start a small business and maintain it. What are you hearing across the spectrum in California?
It kind of answers the question that Senator Murray asked earlier, is that, for me, it takes away my independence to be able to directly work for my employees. A lot of my colleagues and I feel that we're one of the one industry that can work closely to our employees. And I have a great story. I had one hotel in Temecula where we groomed 3 general managers. So the upward mobility of any employee starts from housekeeping to front desk to all the way to management. We feel that this PRO Act would impede that and take away our independence to work directly with them.
Thank you. And chances are this is not going to pass because not all Democrats are for it. But then the next thing that will happen is you'll get an executive order. And the bureaucracy and the regulatory side of life is just as complicated in many cases as it is with, legislation coming down upon you. What do you fear that if legislation isn't passed, and hopefully it won't in this particular act because it needs a lot of refinement, what happens then? What's been your experience dealing with regulations through a bureaucracy as opposed to a law itself?
I'm going to take again. So there's some, it's not that we oppose the entire PRO Act. I do believe that we need to sit together and work on ideas that we can work together that support laborers, but that doesn't destroy the franchise model. So I think every time an act is passed, I don't think they look to how it affects small businesses. I think we need to do a better job writing policies that support us to be able to employ people in our community who has livelihoods that they have to provide for their families. Sometimes when we don't pass the correct act, it impedes that. 25 years ago, I got into this business of running a hotel. It was family run, right? So we all had family. 10 years later, we're employing communities. Today, our company is run by people that are not family. Most of my team members are outside. And anything I can do to help them grow, to pay them more as the standard of living increases and rises, I want to have policies that support that. So I hope I answered your question.
I'm going to get into one of the particulars of the PRO Act, and I think that's where we need to focus because a lot of the general discussion I don't think is going to be as palpable to folks in terms of what this does. PRO Act would require employers to turn over the personal information of their workers to unions, including their shift information, emails, home addresses, and phone numbers. As a business owner, would you feel comfortable doing that in light of protecting the privacy of your employees?
No, and I think it's very simple. We, as the employer, take the risk of our employees, so protecting them and their interests is our number one priority. When it shifts to the franchisors, I don't know if the risk factor is there for them. So with that to be the case, I would say that's my statement.
And then this other question of the corporate versus franchisee. Do you consider yourself an employee of your brand company, and do you want to be an employee of your brand company, or do you need that separation like you might lose through this?
So, no, Senator, thank you for asking that question. I'm an independent entrepreneur. Local franchise businesses, owners like me, have direct control over their own hiring practices, working conditions, wages, and hours of operation. I have a separate employer identification number from all of my franchisees. They file their own taxes and are responsible for following all applicable state, local, and federal law. So we're already being governed to take care of our employees and their best interests. I just don't think the answer is no to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hassan.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay, and thank you, Chair Murray and Ranking Member Braun this morning. And thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. First question to you, Mr. Pierce. We have to protect the rights of workers to organize and collectively bargain. So-called right-to-work legislation has been passed into law in a number of states, and there are ongoing efforts to pass these bills in other states, including my home state of New Hampshire. We know that these so-called right-to-work laws are actually right-to-work for less laws, making it significantly more difficult for workers to form unions and resulting in lower wages, more dangerous working conditions, and less access to health care and other benefits. So, Mr. Pierce, can you explain what Congress can do to address this and help workers collectively bargain?
Thank you for the question. I'm so eager that I didn't turn on my... well, the PRO Act deals directly with the question of right-to-work laws. They eliminate that from the National Labor Relations Act. The right-to-work law exists because it was part of those compromises that were made for the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, and it has an insidious past. Right-to-work laws emanated from legislation that was insisted by Southern senators in order to substantially control people of color in the South from being able to join and enjoy the benefits of unionization. Those vestiges of slavery adjacent processes need to be removed. Otherwise, you have situations where a union is trying to effectively represent employees, including employees that do not have to pay a dime towards those services, yet the union would have to have a duty under the law to zealously represent irrespective of how expensive the process is. That has to change.
Thank you. Another question for you. The COVID-19 pandemic presented new health and safety challenges for workers all across the country and highlighted widespread inequities. The pandemic has also made it more difficult for workers to gather and discuss challenges that they face in the workplace. So how can Congress help address worker inequities that the pandemic exacerbated?
Well, the PRO Act provides opportunities for workers to be able to unionize more freely. Those oppositions to unionization impacts workers' ability to be able to deal with things like the pandemic. As I stated in my opening, it's because of many unions being present at a facility that protections were brought in. Exposures to bad policies and vulnerabilities were made public as a result of union intervention. The PRO Act's provisions will provide that kind of protection for employees.
Thank you. Dr. Scherholz, I have a question for you. We know that when workers organize, it can result in better working conditions and benefits across the board. This can be particularly meaningful for women whose earnings continue to lag behind their male counterparts. So can you talk about how expanding the rights of workers to organize will support women in the workforce, including helping them close the gender pay gap and increase retirement savings?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I talked a little bit about this, but I think what unions do is that they raise wages for workers by allowing workers to join together with their colleagues in a union and collectively bargain. We see higher wages, that women in unions have higher wages than similar women who aren't in unions, better benefits, better working conditions. And then I mentioned this, but I'll just say it again because it's so worth repeating, this idea that the point that workers in unions have better schedules. They have more control over their schedules. They have more advanced notice over their schedules. And so what that means is that people, predominantly women in the society who have care responsibilities, have more predictability in their job, and that makes their working lives much more possible.
And when they earn more, too, they can save more for retirement, right?
Well put, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Last question for Mrs. Heldman. Many workers aren't aware of the rights that they have in the workplace, including laws that protect the rights of workers to organize. You have tirelessly worked to collectively organize your workplace. Do you think workers need to have greater access to information about their right to organize under the law? You need to...
Yes, they do. And I mean, when we try to organize, they always really go out there and some of these people do not know their rights to organize. So they intimidate them and they follow you around and they take you to these captive meetings. And as you're walking into the captive meetings, they're yelling, vote no at the top of their lungs. That's our supervisors. And they sit up there and they say, vote no. And you go out on the floor and they follow you around, they still intimidate you. And they tell this co-workers of mine, they say, if you vote yes for the union, you're going to get fired, you know? And some of these people don't really know their rights, you know, and they lie to them about the union, and they lie to them about everything, and that's why we haven't won our union elections. If not, we would have had that 20 years ago. We would have won our first one.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you. Senator Tuberville.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today, all four of you. Just a short statement here. This is a huge topic back in my state in Alabama, huge. You know, basically this is coming from the people of Alabama. The PRO Act represents a massive power grab to override the will of the voters. Federal power grabs like these are unconstitutional and go against our entire system of government. The PRO Act would overrule the right to work laws across the country and force tens of millions of employees to join a union. Currently, 27 states have right to work laws. Alabama is one of them. Right to work laws give workers freedom. And more importantly, it gives workers the freedom to choose whether to unionize or not. Alabama's right to work law has been a huge benefit for our state because we're in the car business. We've got about 6 or 7 car businesses, manufacturers, Hyundai, Honda, Toyota, Mercedes, 40,000 manufacturing jobs, 40,000. We make 1 million cars, trucks a year, $8.2 billion, and we're not union. By forcing unionization on every worker in the sector, many industries would grind to a halt, especially in Alabama. Employer costs would skyrocket, which could lead to a loss of jobs. Not to mention, like states like Alabama lose the ability to recruit companies. I talked to a CEO this morning, it was in my office, Airbus, a large corporation. I asked him about the PRO Act, and he said it would kill us, absolutely kill us. This corporation would move back to Europe and to other countries. They have to make a profit, but they also love to come where people have the right to choose. On top of that, according to the State Policy Network, the PRO Act would negatively affect 57 million American workers who call themselves freelancers. Unions, to some degree, they have helped this country. They have helped the country. However, in 2021, there are multiple government entities that exist purely to uphold workplace safety standards and protect workers. We got the Department of Labor. We got OSHA. Are we going to start unions and just close that down? We need to give workers the ability to choose. This is a free country. Choice creates competition. Competition breeds success. We used to compete in this country. We're not competing anymore. We want everybody to be the same. Everybody's not the same. You got the right to do as much as you want to do if you put your nose to the grindstone. President Biden says, and he quotes, every worker should have a free and fair choice to join a union. I believe in that statement. But the PRO Act would tip the scales. Among other things, as you've heard, requires workers' personal contact information to be sent to a union. We're already having problems with that. Removes voters to a secret ballot, subjecting them to union coercion, being able to vote out loud, and limits the information workers may receive during a union organizing campaign. That doesn't sound free to me. This is still a free country, folks, free country. And this PRO Act is not going to do anything for us, especially for the people that run this country. That is the hard-working Americans. Mrs. Cirola, you mentioned that in your testimony, the COVID-19 pandemic hit businesses especially hard. If the PRO Act is passed, how will its provisions slow down this much-needed recovery? And why?
You want to turn on your microphone, please?
Can you repeat it one more time? I mentioned
If the PRO Act is passed, how's that going to affect your business?
You know, more so business. It's like 25 years ago we got in. I owned my first hotel in 1996, thinking that I would be able to employ people in my community. If the PRO Act passes, I think the control that I had over overseeing my operation would be given to a third party like the unionization or even our franchisor. Someone that sits 4,000 miles away from me wouldn't be able to control that. I'm going to tell you a little quick story of what happened in 2020, right? So our government shut us down for good reasons to make everyone feel safe. I was scared, and I asked my family members, we're going to have to jump in and pitch in and help our employees because we need to allow them to be comfortable doing what they need to do. So we retained 100% of the people that stayed. For those that didn't stay, we had to roll up our sleeves and start working again. If the PRO Act passes, I don't think we would be having a business to run anymore. That would be number one. Because the scare of anybody wanting to own under the under that PRO Act, I don't think it's going to be a small business, and I don't think it's going to be an American dream story, and I definitely don't think I'm going to be an entrepreneur. So I hope I answered your question with that.
Thank you. You did. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Casey.
Thank you, Chair Murray, and I want to thank you and Senator Braun. Especially want to commend and salute the work of Senator Murray to lead the introduction of and work to pass the PRO Act. And I want to as well thank our witnesses for being here and for your testimony. I want to especially thank Mrs. Heldman for her testimony and her uncommon courage coming forward. That kind of courage is, as I said, all too rare. The fact that you came forward will help others come forward to tell their story, and we appreciate that. At the end of your testimony, you articulated the three words that you hope would encapsulate what a union would mean to you: dignity, justice, and respect. And I want to commend you for reminding us that that's what this debate is all about when it comes to unionization. So I salute your courage. I wanted to pose a question to Mr. Pierce, and I appreciate your work in this area for many, many years and your scholarship, and for reminding us what the National Labor Relations Act, it's not advisory, it's a statute that was passed in 1935, and I think we've seen it degraded for many of the reasons you outlined. It's interesting that we need reminders, but Section 1 that you highlight on page 1 of your testimony that outlines the protection, quote, by workers of full freedom of association, self-organization, and designation of representatives of their choosing, unquote. Nothing could be more American than that, but it's been badly undermined not only by the National Labor Relations Board, but by these efforts that Mrs. Heldman outlined, these union-busting tactics that have gone on for years. I've seen it firsthand in Pennsylvania in many contexts, usually in the context over the last 20 years in healthcare. Union-busting law firms. These are white shoe law firms, big corporations, really, that get paid by the hour to bust unions. As simple as that. And it's in direct conflict with the National Labor Relations Act. So, Mr. Pierce, I'd ask you this. How can we strengthen protections for workers when they're negotiating with their employer for the very first time?
Thank you, Senator Casey, for that question. It's a vital piece of the representation process to be able to effectively negotiate during the time that you've first received certification. The workers are hoping for the best. The employer sometimes does not necessarily take the union-busting tactic during the election campaign. They lay back, and then they wait for bargaining to hardball, to be entrenched, to be extremely recalcitrant. Consequently, you have statistics, the Kate Brofenbrenner study that I put in my testimony shows that less than 50% of unions are able to get a first contract in the first year. The PRO Act, what it does is it intensifies the obligation during that first year of negotiations. It requires mediation. It requires that if the parties cannot reach an agreement, then it can be put to arbitration, where arbitrators make a determination as to whether or not negotiations are being properly effective. The full court press on the first year of negotiations is a vital piece of the PRO Act that would facilitate bargaining going forward. Because once that first year is passed and once that first contract is negotiated, collective bargaining will benefit for everybody.
Thank you very much. I'll just conclude with this, Dr. Shearholes. I don't want to have time to ask you a question. I'll pose some in writing, but on page 1 of your testimony, you said, and I quote, "A worker covered by a union contract earns 10.2% more in wages than a peer with similar education, occupation, and experience in a non-unionized workplace in the same sector," unquote. That and so many other statements that you articulated here today should be lifted up. Thank you, Chair Murray.
Thank you. Senator Moran.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. Let me direct my questions to Ms. Sorolia. Thank you, first of all, for being here today. I want to do what I can to increase the number of jobs that are available to Americans, and one of the likely places for that to occur is in entrepreneurship, new businesses, startups, and one of the places that happens frequently is in franchise relationships. So I want to see what you can tell me about how the PRO Act would hinder or help in regard to that new business startup and the opportunity for franchises to continue to grow. How would the franchise business model ability to promote entrepreneurship be affected by the PRO Act? I'm sorry, I wasn't here if you did.
If you can turn your mic on.
I apologize for always, Senator Murray, for forgetting that. You know, the PRO Act is trying to put another barrier between, for us having direct control over our business versus what the idea of what PRO Act is wanting to do, having the franchisor be involved in running our business. I don't think the ability for me to be able to grow would be there anymore, because it wouldn't be my business that I'd be running. It'd be someone else's business I'd be running. You can see how that's not really the right direction that we should go down to. My family's been in this business since 1952. Entrepreneurship is all they've ever done. I mean, we have grown from one hotel to, if you look at my uncles and my aunts, we probably have 32. But none of us look like we have 32 hotels. We're normal people. We roll up our sleeves. We're cleaning toilets, making rooms. I don't know if we'd be able to do that if a franchisor gets to have better control over our business. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, and I'm sorry that you had to answer it twice.
It's a-
Three hearings all at 10 o'clock this morning. Ms. Sorolla, the California AB5 experience with the ABC test led, I think, to some pretty real consequences for many California workers who had their livelihoods uprooted as a result of these policies. As you know, AB5 ended up being amended to allow exemption for certain category of workers. The PRO Act contains no workers exemption. Given the broad consequences of AB5 and the ABC test on California workers, does it seem like an appropriate standard for the federal government? Does AB5 seem like it should be the standard for what we might do in Congress?
So the answer to that question is no. While the PRO Act proposes to amend the National Labor Relations Act and AB5 amended California state law, franchisees' reaction to the risk involved with both proposals has to be identical. Corporate franchise brands will react to the increased risk by not franchising, taking back contracts when they are up for renewal, or otherwise taking away opportunities to risk the creation, what they created by both proposals. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe my franchisor doesn't want to go into business with me because of the PRO Act, which definitely takes away from being an entrepreneur and a small business owner.
Thank you for your answers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Chair Murray and Senator Braun, and thank you to the witnesses. So I do think we all come at this from our own perspective, and it's been helpful to hear Mrs. Heldman and Ms. Sorolla and Senator Braun's your perspective, so I'll just offer mine in a minute. I grew up in a household very familiar with unions and small businesses. My dad ran an ironworking shop in the stockyards of Kansas City, Missouri, iron crafters, iron worker organized, union members, 5 employees in a tough year, plus my mom and my 2 brothers and me, and in a really great year, maybe 8 or 9 employees. And union and a small business worked just fine. It wasn't a franchise, so I'm hearing, you know, there are different business models, but union and small business worked just fine. I'm sure my dad had some disagreements over time with the union. In a negotiation, you're going to do that. But, you know, he always would tell us, my business acumen will put my workers' kids through college, and their artistry and skill will put you boys through college. He told my 2 brothers and I that a lot. And I saw that they were artists. My dad, one of the honors of his life was at one time the Iron Workers National Pension Fund, which has a board, 3 union reps and 3 employer reps, asked my dad to be on the board. And he said, I only have 5 employees. I mean, this is a national union. Yeah, but you're fair. You're a good business owner. We want you on the board. And he did that for about 10 or 15 years, and it was one of the professional honors of his life. I want to clear up a couple of misconceptions or maybe elaborate a little bit about the PRO Act. So a statement was made earlier that it would take away people's right to vote secretly in a union election. And my understanding is that is not true at all. The PRO Act basically maintains a requirement for secret ballot, except in this condition. If an employer commits an unfair labor practice, and the unfair labor practice is so serious that it jeopardizes the ability to have a fair election, then the NLRB can order a rerun election by card check rather than by secret ballot. But everybody gets to cast a secret ballot in union election under the PRO Act unless the employer violates the law and violates it so seriously that intimidation is so likely that a card check is allowed. Am I wrong about that? That's how I read the PRO Act.
Is that to me?
Yeah, if you would, Mr. Beard. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mr. Beard.
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely correct. And I'd also would like to take the opportunity, if I could, to correct the record with respect to another thing. In terms of the supply of personal information. The senators should know that Excelsior Underwear, which is a Supreme Court case, stated that unions have the right to get the names, the addresses, and the phone numbers of the workers that they are trying to organize, because, of course, they're outside of the facility.
Right. Because in an election, the employer would have that information, and so to make it even, Stephen, the union would want to have it. A second issue. So I think it's really important. People have a right to secret ballot. And it's only after a finding of an unfair labor practice that it could be ordered by card check. Second, this is a really important thing. Mrs. Helderman talked about how hard it is to win a union election against the onslaught of an anti-union campaign. When you finally do win an election, and when the employees say, we want a union, I think it's outrageous that having lost an election, you know, the employer is able to stonewall for sometimes years at a time and not get a contract. I mean, it's like trying to overturn the results of an election. We saw an effort to do that here on January 6th. It wasn't too good. An election should have meaning. And so the provision in the first year to, if there is an election, if the employees say we want a union, that should be able to be converted into a contract in a reasonable period of time. Finally, right to work. Virginia is a right to work state. But I want to focus on something that most people don't focus on, which is if the employees choose a union, then the union is required by law to negotiate for every last member of the bargaining unit, whether or not the person wants to join a union. That is a requirement of the union, is it not?
That is correct.
Right.
Senator.
So if the union is required by law to negotiate for everyone, then I don't think it's unfair for somebody to say, well, I don't want to join the union, but for there to be an agency fee. Okay, you may not want to join the union. You may not want to contribute to the union's political activities or whatever. But since the union is required by law to negotiate for you, and you're getting the pension benefit, and you're getting the salary, and you're getting the health care benefit that the union is negotiating for you, to say, not only I don't want to join the union, but I also don't want to pay for the benefit of the representation that the union is required to carry out on my behalf. I think the notion of the agency fee, letting that be negotiated, and if it is negotiated into a contract, letting that contract be upheld just like we would uphold other contracts at law, seems to me to be very, very fair. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy.
If there was ever a hearing that contrasted the two parties, it would be this. With this side interested in expanding corporate power, both the power of the company that would franchise to others, as well as the power of the union over the individual making her own decision, this is a bill that draws that contrast. My staff gave me we should call this the Consolidation of Corporate Power Act, which the alliteration being CCP, with all the kind of implications of that. By the way, there's some really specious logic in here. All due respect, Mr. Pierce. Somehow in your discussion of the origins of right to work, you suggest that it's somehow embedded in racism, that the current practice is embedded in racism. I'll tell you, my state, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Mississippi, right to work states, have the highest percents of African Americans in the nation. The ability to attract good-paying jobs with right-to-work laws has created untold economic opportunity for people of all races, but certainly those who are of color. Now, my gosh, we could say, no, you just go ahead and stay up north, where the unions traditionally discriminated against blacks. Instead, we opened up the laws, people moved south, and now folks who formerly didn't have jobs have great paying jobs. Not because they're unionized, but because that's industry standard. This, Dr. Sherholtz, I'm reading this thinking, you know, I'm a doctor, I'm not an economist, but in medicine we contrast between association and causation. The fact that union membership has fallen and income inequality has risen, in many respects has no relationship whatsoever, if I may. It's clear that what has happened is that the number of unionized manufacturing jobs has declined. Those of the service industry, SEIU, has greatly increased. Because those manufacturing jobs have declined, in part because companies move manufacturing overseas, because inflexible work rules created a cost disadvantage over factories, manufacturing plants that were located overseas. You can make the case that right-to-work laws have actually created the opportunity for manufacturing to remain in the United States, because it's not just the wage, it is also the inflexibility of work rules that make it difficult. One example of this, and I love your opinion on this, we're speaking about how union laws make things so much safer. You know, there's federal employees that didn't work for 14 months. They didn't work from home. They didn't work in the office. We paid billions in salaries to people who didn't work for 14 months. So I'd call the supervisor. I can't get a passport for someone. Why are they not working? Well, the union won't agree to work rules. Wait, the union won't agree to work rules? Yes, they won't agree to the PPE requirements that would allow people to come in and work safely in order to process passports. And so therefore, we've got this backlog for however long. You know, you want to take your, apparently there's a lot of people that want to get married in Turks cacao. And so my office had to handle a lot of those. Done by supervisors. May have changed now. 14 months, unions objected to that. Those are the kind of work rules that increase cost. And if it's not the taxpayer who just kind of sucks it up and takes it on the chin, if it is a manufacturing plant, they move elsewhere. I kind of dispute this notion that we're getting all this value add from this insistence on safety. By the way, I thought we had OSHA guidelines that kind of demanded safety. I thought OSHA, if not, we better go after the OSHA people if they're not doing their job. One example, I'll just say this, your figure A, showing income equality as union membership. Think about your hospital. Your major hospital in New York City, that CEO is probably making $5 million. Totally unionized workforce, totally unionized. And yet there's no relationship between she or he making $5 million, or maybe more. I'm probably being conservative for, hope I'm conservative all the time, but conservative for a New York CEO of a hospital, relative to what it's all unionized. Again, just because you have an association doesn't mean a causation. We have been evolving from a manufacturing to a service industry, and as that happens, union membership has disproportionately moved to the public sector. Now, Ms. Sherholz, I see you writing things down. What would you say?
Thank you. Thank you for the ability to talk on this. So you are absolutely right that correlation does not mean causation. And in that testimony, that figure A that showed the really rough relationship between rising inequality and unionization, the text in there pointed out that this thing really does show the correlation. Rigorous research that digs in and really gets at causality does show that about a third of the increase in inequality between typical workers and workers at the high end was over the last 40 years was due to the decline in unionization. So it's not the whole rise in inequality is not due to unionization, but a big chunk of it. And the decline in unionization is not primarily the result of the change in sectors from manufacturing, the shift from manufacturing to the service sector in this country. That had something to do with it, but if you look, there's been a decline in unionization both within manufacturing and within services. So a shift from one to the other isn't
causing.
I
know I'm over time, Madam Chair, I apologize, but that in part is because of right-to-work law is used as an economic development tool that brings benefits to people of color included, who otherwise would not have in states formerly impoverished but now doing better.
I'll just say that rigorous.
If somebody else wishes you to speak, that's fine, but she's given me the nod.
Well, thank you so much. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much. I was walking over here during Senator Cassidy's questioning, and so he may have been covering some of the same ground that I hope to cover with you, Dr. Sherholz, on this. sort of extraordinary increase in the gap between the pay of CEOs and average workers. And it sounds like that was the space that Senator Cassidy was in. So maybe I'll just give you an opportunity to sort of continue to expand on your answer. But, listen, people's heads just shake. I mean, frankly, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, when you tell them that today the pay ratio for S&P 500 companies from CEO to worker are 299 to 1. In Connecticut, we've got a cable company, which is a regulated industry in which the CEO is making 687 times the median worker at that cable company. It just doesn't make sense to anybody. And so maybe I'll ask the why question, right? You've got sort of a lot of data to sort of explain how unionization can shrink that differential between CEO executive pay and worker pay, which has never been bigger than it is today. But what drives that? Why is that the case?
That's a really good question. I think the way that I think about this is, as we talked about, the decline of unionization explains a huge share of the rise in inequality over the last 4 decades, and the rise in CEO pay is a really big part of the rise in inequality over the last 4 decades. And I think a useful way to think about it is the decline of unionization has led to a big shift, a big upward redistribution in money from workers to corporate executives and shareholders, and that's where the skyrocketing CEO pay really comes in. And that we just have this incredibly unbalanced playing field right now, and legislation like the PRO Act would do things that would just make it possible for workers who want to join a union, want to join together with their colleagues, to be able to do that.
I think it's a really good point. Without the ability for unions to argue for a bigger share of that money to end up in their pockets, and without other effective checks on the explosion of CEO pay, that imbalance just gets worse and worse. Mr. Pierce, I know we've talked in and around this subject of abuses that happen during organizing drives. And again, maybe I'm treading on a little bit of ground that's already been covered, but we had an instance in Connecticut where groups of workers were trying to organize at McDonald's restaurants that were part of our rest stops along the highway. And there's reporting to suggest that as a means of trying to intimidate those workers, McDonald's actually called ICE and sent in immigration enforcement officials to threaten family members of workers. Just absolutely extraordinary tactics. There are much more sort of mundane and more pedestrian intimidation tactics that take place all the time. And it seems that our current enforcement structure is just not nearly strong enough to disincentivize these kind of abuses. Why does the current system not work to create a level playing field? Why does it allow for so many employers to get away with captive audience meetings and threats and sort of low-level intimidation? It just, at least anecdotally in Connecticut, as I talk to folks that are trying to organize workers, and I talk to workers, the breadth of intimidation and harassment seems to have exploded. And it just doesn't seem like our current regulatory structure can keep up with the ways in which employers and union busters innovate to try to prevent folks from being able to cast a legitimate, free and fair ballot as to whether they want to join a union.
It's a simple cost of doing business because the penalties are so light. Yeah. We're talking about an agency that is incapable of self-enforcing its orders, and we're talking about an agency that cannot impose any kind of sanctions that have a meaningful bite to it. Quite frankly, and I've said this before, I would submit that an employer can fire an individual who is trying to start a union and put the money that would probably be owed to that employee when reinstated in a simple interest-bearing bank account, and by the time the employer was obliged to have to pay the employee back, the employer would have made money and would have been able to stop unionization and probably write the expense off as a business expense. This is why the PRO Act changes the game. One, it gives solid damages to the employees and if the employer has engaged in these unfair labor practices. And two, it mandates that the General Counsel go in and seek injunctions when employees get terminated, so employees are not caught in the weeds for inordinate periods of times before justice comes about.
Well said. Thank you both. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first time I heard of the PRO Act and reviewed it, I asked myself, what's broken? What are they trying to fix? And I concluded, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And worse is that it harms small businesses. And I'm going to submit a letter for the record. I'm going to quote this from the NFIB. The radical legislation would dramatically upend longstanding employment law in favor of labor unions at the expense of small businesses and employees. I could not have said it better, and Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit this letter from the NFIB for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. My first question to Dr. Sherrills. Across the country, thousands of Americans have realized their American dream of owning a small business through the franchise business model. The PRO Act would dramatically expand the joint employer standard, putting the government squarely in the middle of the employer-employee relationship and potentially making business owners liable for actions taken by other companies. My question, would you agree that the expansion of the joint employer definition threatens the ability of small businesses to utilize independent contractors?
No, I wouldn't. What the joint employer standard does is it actually helps small businesses. It helps franchisees. They are already required to be at the bargaining table under the NLRA with a union. What the joint employer standard would do, a strengthened joint employer standard in the PRO Act would make it so the big company, the franchisor, would also be required to be there if they actually do have control over the conditions of work of those workers, so that the workers.
Do you really think that 10% of franchise companies would agree with you, or would it be less than that?
I have no idea how much franchise companies would agree with me, but what I know is I did a very in-depth, rigorous look at what the joint employer rule, the Trump joint employer rule that limited that weakened the joint employer standards, the impact of that on workers, and found that it would cost workers more than $1.3 billion a year by reducing their ability to bring all firms who have control over their conditions of work to the bargaining.
We'll just have to agree to disagree. I think it would destroy the franchise model, which is the backbone of so many small businesses and so many success stories as well. My next question for Mr. Pierce. Only 6% of the private sector employees belong to a union, and recent unions drive across the country have failed. Additionally, 27 states have passed right-to-work laws, including my home state of Kansas, protecting a combined 81 million workers nationwide from being forced to pay union dues in order to retain a job. I also have a list, Madam Chair, to ask unanimous consent to submit the document highlighting Democrat leader support for right-to-work laws to the record.
Without objection.
So my question, Mr. Pierce, is this. Why should the federal government restructure federal law in their favor when unions are failing to make a compelling case to workers?
Unions are failing to make a compelling case to workers because unionization is being blocked by unfair labor practices, and it's difficult for workers to be able to vote for a union. Statistics and studies have shown that the majority of workers surveyed, if had the opportunity to join a union, that they would. What has happened is high percentages, close to 50% of unfair labor practices occur during the organizing campaign. Further, unions don't have access to the facility. It's like two candidates running for an election, but one has to campaign outside of the country in order to get elected. There is basic inequity in the process, and therefore that has to be changed, and the process has to go to a neutral site so the unions have a fair opportunity.
I got a yes or no question. The PRO Act would, and I'll go back to you, Mr. Pierce. The PRO Act would force workers to pay $1,000 or more in mandatory annual dues. You know, speaking of inequities, do you agree this would disproportionately impact low-income workers? Yes or no?
No.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair Murray and Senator Braun, and welcome to our witnesses. It's great to be here with you today. So I start from the place that everyone in this country should have the right to come together and collectively organize for better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, safer working conditions, and that when this happens, working people have the opportunity to reap the actual value of their labor. The right to organize people empowers working families like Ms. Heldman's. And in short, it gives Americans, all Americans, the freedom and the opportunity to build the lives that they want. To me, this is what is at stake in this moment as we think about strengthening and modernizing labor laws that, as you all, many of you have said so eloquently, are so out of date. Dr. Schierholz, I'd like to ask you a question, really to respond to this argument that I hear from time to time, which is that strengthening labor rights comes at the expense of U.S. competitiveness. That basically if workers have more power and more representation, this argument goes, that this hurts businesses, they become less competitive, they create fewer jobs, and that this slows economic growth. So, Dr. Schierholz, could you address this argument?
Turned off my talking. It's a really important question. What the evidence shows on unions is that they have really productivity enhancing features. Like, for example, when job quality is better because unions are there to do things like get better wages, benefits, working conditions, turnover goes down. Turnover is incredibly expensive and productivity draining for companies. So that's one thing, like one really key important thing that unions do. Another thing is they can make a company just run much more efficiently, because what it does, it allows for an entity that can aggregate worker interests and worker information and communicate that to management, which can really be an important way to help an organization run more productively, actually more efficiently, be more competitive. So I think this is typically just, it doesn't bear out when you look at what really goes on.
Well, and also, as there seems to be such strong evidence that the rights of individuals to organize increases their income, that makes our economy more fair. Yeah. A more fair economy is, I would argue, a more competitive economy. A more fair economy actually creates more growth rather than stifling growth. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly. One of the ways that I would also characterize that is, as we've seen rising inequality, as a much higher share of overall income is going to people who already have a lot of money. That actually hurts our economy, because people who already have a lot of money, if they get a little bit more, they're not likely to spend it on goods and services because they already have what they need. So what unions do by getting money in the pockets of working people, by getting money in the pockets of middle-class people, it really does stimulate economic activity, because those are folks that if they get an extra $1,000 a year, they get an extra few $1,000s a year, it's going to go right into the economy.
That's right, right. You know, the Economic Policy Institute has a really compelling chart, which it shows productivity growth compared to worker compensation over time. And what's interesting about this chart is, during most of the post-war period, productivity growth and workers' compensation they sort of move together. But then that changes, and after a while, starting at around 1979, those lines diverge. The two lines begin to separate, which essentially means that, the way I understand it, I'm not an economist either, that workers are not benefiting from that productivity growth. So could you explain that to us, and can you explain what impacts, kind of like how that matches up with what's happening with unionization in this country?
Yeah, you explained it really well, that what we have seen since the 80s is the economy growing relatively strongly, productivity increasing, but the gains of that productivity growth not going to working people largely. It's largely being captured by people who already have the most. And one reason for that, one key reason for that, is the decline of unionization that really does do this sort of upward redistribution of money from workers to corporate executives, shareholders. Fundamental reform like the PRO Act really would help halt and reverse those trends and move us towards an economy that works for everyone, not just for a little slice at the top.
Right. I mean, I think that what we've seen, thank you for that, what we've seen is after years of concerted, coordinated effort to whittle away at workers' rights, that it is time for Congress to address that imbalance. And by addressing that imbalance, we will be able to address the greater imbalances in our economy. That means that it doesn't work for everyone. And as Paul Wellstone from my state of Minnesota used to say, we can get back to a place, hopefully to a better place, where we all do better when we all do better. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting this incredibly important hearing. And thank you to the ranking member also. Mr. Pierce, as a former National Labor Relations Board chairman, you have witnessed how worker misclassification has hurt the interests of workers and their efforts to collectively bargain. There has been a lot of misinformation out there about what the Protecting the Right to Organize Act will do to address worker misclassification. And I'd like to just urge us, let's be clear and address this once and for all. What problem is the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act's ABC test, trying to fix? And how will it work? And will it require freelance workers to become W-2 employees?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. I'm glad to have the opportunity to clear that up. First of all, the ABC test, more or less, basically has the ability to discern whether or not an individual worker is truly an employee under the National Labor Relations Act for the purposes of the Act's coverage. The ABC test assumes that someone is an employee unless the worker is free from the employer's control or direction in performing work. The work takes place outside of the usual business. So if somebody has a bakery and they have a worker they hired somebody to install ovens, clearly that's not baking. So that's not going to be considered the same as being an employee. And customarily the work that is being performed is independently done. So if the person is installing ovens, do they have a business of installing ovens? Well, clearly they're not employees of that employer. The ABC test discerns that, and it's not new. It's being done by half of the states in this country for the purpose of wage and hours and other benefits and unemployment insurance. So what it does is codify that standard so that it would apply in discerning who is eligible for coverage under the National Labor Relations Act.
Thank you. Ms. Heldman, thank you so much for your testimony and your presence here and your efforts to organize your workplace.
Thank you.
As you know, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act allows the NLRB to assess monetary penalties for labor law violations and imposes personal liability on executives responsible for such violations. how would your employer perhaps have acted differently during your union drive if they knew that they could be liable for fines of up to $50,000 per labor violation?
Well, if they knew that, we would have won our first election, and we would have not lost that election, and they would have thought twice about firing union supporters and how they treated people and how they pulled us in the office and interrogate us and tell us to vote no, and be out there on the floor right on our faces and telling us to vote no, and following us wherever, and using us as examples to vote no because we don't need a union. They would make them think twice. You know, I really think they would make them think about what they're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Turn to Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Chair Murray, Senator Braun, and really thank you for holding this hearing today so we can have a discussion about how important the right to organize is to ensure our good-paying, safe jobs for workers all across our states. And I come from Nevada. Nevada, built by union workers. It runs today because of the work that the union members do. The Nevada AFL-CIO has worked to raise wages, secure benefits, and ensure safe working conditions for workers all over our state. The SEIU and Teamsters locals in Nevada, well, it's COVID right now, so they're fighting for our nurses, our caregivers. They're fighting for our convention workers, bus drivers, other men and women all across our state. I want to say hardest hit in the nation with unemployment this last year. And I also want to mention that our culinary union, 226, turned 85 years old last year and celebrated decades of providing hundreds of thousands of Nevada hospitality workers a pathway to the middle class. And during the darkest days of the pandemic, unions delivered food to the furloughed workers, helped them sign up for their unemployment benefits, ensured they had a right to return to their jobs as Nevada carefully reopens and welcomes back visitors. And I myself am a former member of Culinary Union 226. I'm proud of that. And Unite Here and our other Nevada unions that are fighting to protect workers, secure benefits for their families. My grandmother was a lifelong member of the Baker and Confectioners Union. And so I know a little bit about unions, and I want to thank all of you for fighting for that. But Mr. Pierce, we tend to hear a lot, my colleagues are talking about this, these competing narratives. That is the PRO Act really necessary? People will do the right thing. Businesses will do the right thing. And is it necessary for achieving workplace democracy? And can you explain that concept of workplace democracy, why it's important, and how strengthening our right to organize can not only help us achieve a more democratic workplace, but I would say a more harmonious workplace?
Thank you so much, Senator, for this opportunity. So often I'm hearing that what unions are doing is undemocratic. It's violating employees' democratic rights. What folks fail to realize is that without legislation, there is no democracy in the workplace. It is the National Labor Relations Act that provided democracy in the workplace. And the whole idea was balance the playing fields, bring workers with an opportunity to have a seat at the table. The PRO Act provides and facilitates collective bargaining in an enhanced way in environments that are comparable to the 21st century, so that employees have a better chance to be able to bring democracy into the workplace. I talked about the value of the collective bargaining agreement. It is the contract, the constitution of the workplace, mutually negotiated. It's important because it provides abilities for people to have safe working conditions, to employees to be able to be hired and retain their jobs with just cause standards and not be subject to cronyism or possible racism, all of those things that are vital to have workplace integrity. And that's the importance of it.
Well, you speak about some of this, and we know all too well that the pandemic this last year has really laid bare the disparities that have always existed. So, Dr. Sherholz, Black and Latino unemployment at their peaks were higher than unemployment for white workers, including in my home state of Nevada, which has one of the largest Latino populations in the country. Can you talk about the benefit of unionization for Black and Latino workers in particular, please?
Yeah, it's really an important thing to highlight. I think that there is this idea, because unionization started and it didn't have a lot of people of color originally, was mostly men, that there's this idea that that's still how it is, and it could not be farther from the truth. The unions really do reflect the diversity of our country as it is today, and there's enormous benefits to people of color of unions. So Black workers and Hispanic workers get a bigger boost to being in unions than white workers do. All workers get a boost to being in unions, but it is more important. The boost is bigger for people of color. Black workers are more likely to be in unions than white workers. And you put all that together, unions are just an incredibly important force for racial economic justice in this country. It's just, if we take seriously this national discussion we're having about racial economic justice, and a really important thing that we have to do there is boost unionization.
Thank you. I appreciate all of your time here today.
Thank you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to just briefly go over some territory that I think Senator Casey touched on, and Dr. Sherholz, you've commented on, but that parallel between the shrinking of the middle class of America with the reduction, the shrinking of the percentage of workers who are represented by organized labor. Has that been pretty consistent over the whole, when you look back over the last 5 decades, has that been a pretty consistent process?
I think I understand your question, but yes, as we have seen unionization decline, that has been accompanied by this increase in inequality. And then if you look over the whole period, you really can look and see that that decline in unionization was causally related. A big chunk was the reason for a big chunk of that rise in inequality. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I was asking more about just looking at the size of the middle class, how you want to define it in the United States, that has been shrinking by almost every measure over the last 50 years. That causality.
Yes, it's interesting. There's a sort of a structural trend over time in stagnant wages for working people over most of that period. There's been some breaks, like when we have strong expansions, the expansion of the late 90s, we did see some gains for working people, but the broader trend really has been just over that whole period, just a steady erosion of the ability of our economy to deliver for all workers.
Got it. I appreciate that. And also, when I was governor of Colorado, I signed an executive order that set up we call it an enforcement task force. We were looking at alleged worker misclassification, basically tax fraud, payments under the table in the construction industry. And we did this because when not everyone's playing by the same rules, it really penalizes those that do play by the rules, the law-abiding businesses. They were being undercut. And I think when some workers within an industry are allowed to join a union and others not, again, it creates an unlevel playing field. I've heard concerns from some of my friends in the business community about the ABC test within the PRO Act is being applied more broadly, possibly outside the NLRA. Can you confirm and just reiterate that the ABC test within the PRO Act will only be used regarding workers' rights to join a union? And then can you explain how this test could help, how it would help level the playing field?
Yeah, that's a good question, and you're absolutely right. The PRO Act would only amend the NLRA, no other worker protection statute. So it would only, the test for an employee would, in the bill, would only apply to the rights workers have under the NLRA, which is essentially unions and collective bargaining. So that's 100% true. And then what the test would do is just help ensure that all workers are properly classified. And I think you brought up a really important point. Most employers actually classify their workers correctly. But what this would do is make it so those bad apple companies that are unable to or less able to misclassify their workers and gain that competitive advantage. So in that way, it really does help level the playing field amongst all companies.
Great. And then, Mr. Pierce, most business owners do everything they can to comply with the law, oftentimes with limited resources. I was a small business person myself for many years. We've heard some concerns that the PRO Act will force small businesses to comply with excessively burdensome federal regulations. How would you respond to those concerns, and how can we better educate and equip business owners to facilitate their compliance with the law?
Well, I guess I just disagree that it would require employers to comply with more burdensome federal regulations. The PRO Act does nothing towards making employers have to comply with anything more than they already are obliged to. If anything, the PRO Act would enable employers to have a little bit more clarity with respect to their rights and obligations under the law. They would have the opportunity to be further educated with respect to union and employee rights under the National Labor Relations Act, so it's not going to be an invisible situation. Many employers, given my many years involved with the National Labor Relations Board, oftentimes fall into situations where they commit unfair labor practices out of ignorance. I mean, some employers do it with malicious intent, but some just do it because they don't know. The PRO Act will provide an educational system for that everybody to be aware of. There'd be a requirement that notices be posted so people would know what their rights are. Now, employers would be obliged to report when they're hiring persuaders to union bust, and that would be certainly a new obligation on the part of the employer. But that's all.
Right. Great. I appreciate you providing that clarification. Right. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we've had a robust conversation here today, and I want to make a couple comments. I think bad apple companies like Mrs. Heldman talked about is a reason we need to have the discussion. Senator Murphy was talking about public company CEO pay. Never would be for stuff like that where you've got a proportion of 290 or even 200 or even 100 to 1. That gives companies a bad name, but I don't think you can generalize upon that, because it gets back to my thesis on all of this. If this act in any way impinges upon small business, I think it hurts the future of unions and businesses to get large. I want you to answer as briefly as you can, Mr. Pierce, Dr. Sherholtz. I view this as a flattened triangle with small businesses at the bottom, unions, and larger businesses at the top. This will be a bill that is a one-size-fits-all. Do you think there's a place to where you differentiate so you don't kill the golden goose that produces large companies over time, creates jobs generally as the progenitor of them? Would you be comfortable with something that distinguished between unions and large business, and how this might impact small business? Mr. Pierce.
What I would say is this: the vast majority of bargaining units in the United States are average at about 20 to 25 employees. So the unionization was pretty much created in an atmosphere that under current standards would be a small business atmosphere. Small businesses are the backbone of this country, and I agree. I believe that the PRO Act does nothing to jeopardize small businesses' abilities to function and proceed. In fact, the PRO Act provides opportunity for clarity. As I indicated to Senator Hickenlooper, there will be a greater understanding of rights and obligations. And those businesses that love their employees and provide more for them, those employees may believe that they don't need to be unionized as a result.
I'd make the point that the difference between unions and a small business and business owners just taking care of their employees is almost no difference. I think where it comes into play, and even though the average might be there, I think the bigger issues are with larger entities. Dr. Sherholz.
Yeah, I would say that just like you said, small business owners are the ones who know their employees. They are like family. They know their kids. They know what's going on in their lives. They want to be able to pay their workers more, provide them benefits, all the things that make a good quality job. If larger union-busting firms are able to crack down on unions and so doing reduce wages, reduce benefits, that actually hurts the small business's competitive advantage. So leveling that playing field actually makes these small businesses who want to do right by their workers better off. The PRO Act will actually make that happen.
I'm fearful that you throw the baby out with the bathwater there. So just as a food for thought. And real briefly, devils are always in the details. I think this is going to affect the gig economy. It's a growing freelance part of our economy that's growing. Independent contractor status, which many small employers have to use because they don't have a position that could hire an individual in. We got to be careful that we don't attenuate them. And in this case, in terms of binding arbitration, that you can trigger within 100 days and basically have a panel come in and put a working agreement or a contract out there is not good. And then finally, very briefly, Ms. Cerolio, do you want to add anything else to wrap up the conversation from an independent business owner?
If there are any ideas that we all, like me too, can work together to support workers by not destroying the franchise model, I'm going to sign myself up to make it my work. So understand that everyone's sitting in this room. The second thing, I know we talked about what keeps turnover from our businesses. You know, as small business owners, creating the right culture and paying a standard of living, which is what my company has done, that really attributes to keeping the turnover. And I'm not great with statistics, but I can tell you with my gut instinct of doing this job, all the jobs that are employed under me and their work, we're one of the only industry, I think, the hospitality, travel, and tourism, where we all started out cleaning rooms or folding towels, delivering laundry at the age of 9, which, you know, labor wasn't part of it back then, but we did that at a younger age, so we have a lot of respect for those that we actually employ, but we want to do nothing but to see them also be a part owner of the business that we are. Who better than our industry to be able to do that? So that's that. You know, the other thing is, you know, how does it threaten this business? I want to end with this one, Senator. The PRO Act is such a mammoth proposal. It would upend my business in 2 ways. And it's the first 2 provisions in the bill specifically that I'm really passionate about. First, the PRO Act's joint employer standard is unpredictable. No one here can assure a franchise brand that its business may not run afoul of nebulous, indirect, and reserve control standard. Ultimately, the PRO Act's joint employer standard would take away the incentives to franchise. These are changes that would take away the investment, the equity, and the independence of franchise franchise small business owners like me. And who really wants to, under the ABC test, I don't want to be the employer of the franchisor when it's my business that I own. Just doesn't make sense. Second, the ProAct's independent contractor test features an A-prong that most franchises would likely fail. That's because the A-prong sets up a conflict of laws with the Layman Act, which requires franchisers to have the same control that the ProAct prohibits. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in that language. And I want to end with that in terms of what it would do and impact me as a small business. Thank you, Senator Braun.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have one additional question before our hearing ends, and that's to you, Mrs. Heldman. And I really appreciate your testimony here, but you, like millions of other essential workers, continued to go to your work site during the pandemic to make sure that Americans had access to what they needed goods and services. And like many essential workers, you feared for your safety and the economic impact of illness on yourself and your colleagues and your families. I wanted to just have you tell us how the pandemic affected your views on the need for a union.
Well, they would hire new people and they would bring them, trade them out, in and out, right next to you. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic, and they didn't have no mask for us. They didn't give us masks until Mondelez gave a mask to give us masks. And I just, I told them, I go, I feel they're trying to get me to get COVID-19 because they just keep trading these people in and out. And I asked them, I go, why are you guys doing this? This is the beginning of a pandemic, and the girl for the IS office that takes these new people around, she just went like, F and this, F and them, my F and boss, this and that. And I was like, wow. I went to the office and I go, you know what? She don't need to talk to me like that. I just asked her, why are you guys doing this? This is the beginning of a pandemic, And the girl gave me a lame excuse. I don't remember what it was, but it was just an excuse. And then she said, did you have any witnesses out there? Because she made it sound like I was trying to cause trouble or whatever. And I go, yeah, I have witnesses that they watch do this and tell me this stuff. Yeah, I do. And then she calmed down because I think they were going to try and get me fired or something. And then, we had like 73 by the fall. We had 73 cases. Once we done our voting, they quit telling us what our cases were up to. We weren't allowed to have no more information.
So you didn't know who else was being infected?
But in January, a lady passed away. She was in the hospital from November to January, and then she passed away from COVID. And then July 1st, we just lost a guy. He was 50 years old. And that day, when the guy died, they said, you guys don't need to wear your mask anymore. And people started, some of them started not wearing their mask, but then you got a lot of them that are wearing their mask, And then also, all this captain meetings, they would just cram us in there. And it was like, are we really serious? This is the middle of a pandemic. Are you guys really serious, And they would put like semis on the street, like they crammed us into this tent, 150 of us, and then they put cement barrels right along them trailers, and then all them supervisors were right there, and some of the supervisors were sitting out there with us and yelling, union no. And then where we would stand and handbill and talk to people, they went out there and they put cement barrels all along the public sidewalk for we wouldn't be able to stand out there and talk to people or stand out there, period. This is a public sidewalk, and then they put chains on them, so we weren't able to hang out there. And, we had a girl come in and she told them, she goes, I'm not feeling good today. And they took her temperature and they didn't pay attention to her. Well, she went out there, she worked all day, and then she got the pandemic. She got a fever, I think, later on in the day, and then they sent her home, and then she had to quarantine, and then she came back. But this stuff like that, and that's how they handle the pandemic. That's what it was.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of our witnesses today and all of our colleagues for their participation, Mr. Pierce, Dr. Shearholtz, Mrs. Heldman, Ms. Sorolia. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with the committee today. I seek unanimous consent to put in the record 6 letters from organizations in support of the PRO Act. So ordered. So for any senators who wish to ask additional questions for the record will be due in 10 business days, August 5th, 5 p.m. The hearing record will remain open until then for members who wish to submit additional material for the record, and this committee will next meet Tuesday, July 27th in Dirksen 430 for a hearing on how we learn the lessons of this pandemic and strengthen our nation's public health and preparedness systems. The committee stands adjourned.